for Malcolm Turnbull, an LNP loss would, at the very least, reinforce the view that he doesn't play well north of the Tweed.
Yeah, I think unfortunately for Malcolm Turnbull there are going to be some implications for the federal scene, and I say unfortunately because I think it's very likely that Anastasia Palaszczuk and the Labor Party is going to be returned in Queensland. I think off the polling you'd have to say that it's an uphill battle for Tim Nicholls and the LNP. Whether the Greens can take Jackie Tradd's seat off her in South Brisbane, whether One Nation can take 3 seats around Townsville, maybe 4. We'll see. Any more than that makes it very, very interesting, I think. But I think it's likely that that's probably the way that things will go down today. And again, as I said, I think it's quite likely that Anastasia Palaszczuk will be returned as Premier. And I think that does have some implications for Malcolm Turnbull, although Queensland, of course, is a very different state to anywhere, really, around the rest of the country.
Well, that's one of the things that makes it so interesting and why it does have national implications, and you can go back election after or election right back into the 1980s because it does shift around quite a lot, and a lot more than Victoria and New South Wales, the other 2 big states, do traditionally, and that's why there's a focus even when it's on state issues.
Indeed, and if the Labor Party is returned, one of the really interesting things about this election is that it will be very similar to the last time Queensland went to the polls, which is something that's very unusual for Queensland. Usually things swing wildly, and we saw that in both 2012 and 2015. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens today, and really the only factor I think at this stage that is left up in the air is the One Nation factor and how many seats they can bring home tonight.
Yes, indeed, that is the case, and very difficult to tell, not just because of the looseness of their numbers on the ground, but also the indiscipline in terms, at the very least, of preference flows from One Nation. Very hard to work out. Ben Oquist, a simple question first. What's your mail on South Brisbane and Jackie Tradd? Is she really at risk?
I don't think so, because people haven't focused on the fact that the LNP are preferencing Labor over the Greens in South Brisbane. The word there is there isn't that many LNP hander-outers, but I think it would be hard for the Greens to overcome a preference flow against them there. I'd be more interested in looking at the seat of Maywa, which the Shadow Treasurer is in, Scott Emerson, which is a genuine 3-way race probably now between Labor, the Greens and the Liberals. So I'd be watching that seat more closely. But a preference is obviously going to play a big role everywhere. Even in the polls that we've seen in the paper today, they're based on an assumed preference flow of 60-40 from One Nation to the LNP. We just don't know whether it will be stronger or less than that. So I do think it's hard to predict, even on the polls which everyone says have been firming in Labor's favour, that we can say that Labor's kind of certainly going to win. We just don't know where that One Nation preference flow will go, one. Secondly, if One Nation finishes second in a seat compared to third in a seat, can hinge on 1 or 2%, and that can mean their preferences are important or they're in the running to win the seat. It does look very difficult, though, for the LNP to win a majority government. So the most likely outcome for them is, if they get over the line, is a minority government with One Nation. And, of course, that presents all sorts of problems for Malcolm Turnbull as well. And he's in an invidious position here, isn't he? Because if Labor wins, he'll be seen to have done badly, and if the LNP win, they'll be in a deal with One Nation. And just lastly, I think that the campaign has been one of the big issues, is on state factors, as you said, but as we know, one of the big issues that's dominated is Adani. And whatever the outcome...
Excuse me for interrupting. On that very question, though, Ben, if the opposite, it turns out to be the case, and LNP, or rather Labor cannot form a majority, then Anastasia Palaszczuk's rather clumsy Adani gambit will have come to naught.
I'm not sure about that, Jim, because One Nation has says it wants to veto the loan as well. So One Nation has said on air to Alan Jones and others that it wants to make that a condition of forming government. So I think kind of whatever the outcome of the election, one thing that came out of the campaign is that loan to Adani, wherever you stand on the mine, is seen to have been toxic. That Sky People's Forum, I think, is a turning point in the whole Adani campaign when David Spears asked the crowd who supported subsidies to Adani, and no one put up their hand. And I think overall then that's kind of flowed on into a kind of tarnishing of the Adani project, and politicians are going to think again about getting too close to it. So I think that's going to be a big take out of the election result, whatever happens.
I want to get to Lee Rhiannon in a moment, but first to the Bennelong by-election. Interesting story in the Canberra Times today suggesting that Christina Keneally had been sounded out as a possibility for what will be the third Canberra seat once the next redistribution is completed. Simon, this is not the kind of news you would want when you're running for a by-election in another state. It really does look a bit like Christina Keneally's behaving like a carpetbagger.
Well, I thought she was going to be back here on Sky News after losing the Bennelong election. So we'll see, I guess, what happens. But of course, this is not the kind of news that you want to have in the middle of a campaign, particularly what is likely to be a fairly close campaign. You want to make sure that there aren't too many missteps along the way. And I think for Christina Keneally's campaign, this is pretty clearly one of those. I think it's going to be a very close result anyway. I mean, whether this is the thing that gives John Alexander the edge or whether it's something else, the Liberal Party is, of course, throwing everything at this to try and make sure that they retain government, because they are in a very, very tricky situation indeed if John Alexander is not to get across the line. Given that that's the case for the government, of course, the Labor Party is throwing everything that they can at this seat as well to try and take it off the coalition. So it's a fascinating contest, this one, but it just looks as though Christina Keneally is sort of making a comeback in politics, and she doesn't really care where she goes, whether it's Bennelong or whether it's somewhere in the ACT, which I think is just a terrible look. And I think that, especially given what is happening during this election, where people will think that due to a legal constitutional technicality, the person that they chose at the last election is being turfed out and then it's up to them to put him back in again. I think things like this are a complication that Christina Keneally probably doesn't want.
Ben Oquist, Lee Rhiannon, interestingly enough, after she was dumped by the New South Wales branch of the Greens, I did seek a comment from Greens leader Richard Di Natale and was told not yet. Does this mark the beginning of a real change in New South Wales, which your former boss Bob Brown was saying had to change and Lee Rhiannon had to go? Pretty much the same from Richard Di Natale, or is it just shuffling the deck chairs?
It is an interesting and surprising result. Lee Rhiannon was thumped in this pre-selection, and you're right, I think Bob Brown set the clock ticking 12 or 18 months ago when he called on Lee Rhiannon to step down and make way for a new generation, much as he has done. And I think it's probably good news for the Greens that generational change can happen. Lee was seen as a pretty divisive figure, and she fell foul of her colleagues when she was seen to be campaigning against them on that Gonski education policy that the government was trying to, that the Greens were trying to negotiate with the government at the time. I think that was kind of the last straw after Bob Brown called Lee out a couple of times. And it is surprising because no sitting Greens MP, to my knowledge, at state or federal level in any state, has ever lost a pre-selection, and she's lost this in a big way. So it does potentially mark some kind of big change going on in the New South Wales Greens, and I think that's going to be a net positive for them.
Simon, there will not be, I think I've got this right, and cannot be a Senate election, a half-Senate election, until the middle of 2019. I would have thought that gives Senator Rhiannon a very big opportunity to be a loose cannon and a problem for the Greens for quite some time to come.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. It's a bizarrely early pre-selection. I mean, I've got to say, I'm ignorant as to the internal workings of the Greens, and particularly when it comes to pre-selections. So it seems very, very early to me and very strange, especially given that we're dealing with Lee Rhiannon here. I would have thought that in terms of the strategy of dealing with Lee Rhiannon as a somewhat difficult entity for the New South Wales Greens and for the Greens at a federal level, you'd try and push this off as far as possible, particularly if you thought the writing was on the wall for her and Maureen Faruqi was likely to take over. If it is a surprise, then okay, maybe they thought they were dealing with this issue earlier and that Rhiannon was going to be put back in that number one spot again. But very, very strange. We'll see over the coming months what she's got planned. But gee, if her history is anything to go by, I think she'll be a serious thorn in the side of Richard Di Natale and the rest of her party. And who knows what she can do. But look, from me, it's all smiles because I think she's one of the more radical elements of the Greens. And in a party like the Greens, if you're a radical, you're pretty far to the left. So I think it's good that she's been shot out of a cannon. And I don't think there'll be too many sensible people around the country who'll be too sad to see her go.
Ben, do you think it shows that the operating principle of the New South Wales branch of the Greens is finally starting to shift? Do you think, for example, that this may produce the possibility of better performance in lower house seats in Sydney, notably the seat of Sydney, and of course Grayndler?
Yeah, I think that's what they'll be hoping, and Bob Brown has kind of called the underperformance of the New South Wales Greens out a couple of times, and they haven't gone too close to winning those House of Reps seats in the past. Having said that, both Tanya Plibersek and Anthony Albanese are very popular members and they're going to be hard to dislodge, but ultimately those MPs will go, and I think that's the Greens' next big chance. You're right though, the Senate election can't take place until after mid next year, even if there was an early House of Reps election. But I read in The Guardian this afternoon that there is expected to be enormous pressure on Senator Rhiannon to go ahead of that election and resign and let the seat be filled by a casual vacancy, which sometimes happens in all political parties when senators lose their pre-selection. So that might be the motivation there for having a pre-selection early when somebody is seen to be on the skids. But overall, I do think it will be a net positive for the Greens because Rhiannon has played her politics in a certain divisive style. She's only got that one divisive gear that she plays internally as well as externally. And I saw quotes this afternoon with Greens saying the war is over in the Greens. And as we know, disunity and division are death in politics, and if you can put some of that behind you, you'll undoubtedly go well. As I said, Bob Brown called this out early. The clock was ticking and the clock has struck.
And just very briefly, Simon Breeny, if indeed, as Ben's suggesting, the way in which New South Wales Greens have behaved in the past is changing, this does make it something that Labor really does have to consider in the inner suburbs of Sydney, and at the very least means more resources going into those vulnerable seats.
Well, I think the Labor Party's been conscious of this for some